You open your app to check your food assistance balance and see that the amount for November is noticeably lower than in normal months. Where did the technical language behind that number come from? Who decided it? And why did state agencies receive one directive after another from Washington over just a few days? Behind that shifting balance is a series of documents issued by the U.S. Department of Agriculture, USDA, and the Food and Nutrition Service, FNS, in November 2025, packed with phrases like partial benefits, 35% reduction, temporary full benefits, and then undue issuances. This report focuses on unpacking those documents, strictly based on what has been made public, so SNAP recipients can understand what actually happened to their benefits. The starting point of this paper trail is November 4, 2025. On that date, FNS issued guidance on November's SNAP benefits in the context of a federal government shutdown and a temporary lapse in normal appropriations for the program. In this guidance, FNS stated that it could only rely on the program's contingency reserve to pay a portion of monthly benefits. The agency's calculations showed that the remaining funds in the reserve were only sufficient to cover roughly half of the usual benefit levels households received. In plain language, FNS told states that maximum benefits for the month would be sharply reduced from normal levels and instructed them to adjust their payment systems accordingly to reflect these significantly lower benefit amounts. What stands out in the November 4 document is how FNS lays down the concept of partial benefits as a baseline. Rather than committing to use every available tool to maintain full benefits, the agency framed the decision as a purely financial calculation: how much remains in the contingency fund, and what share of normal benefits that amount can cover. This forced many states to tell their residents they would only receive a fraction of their usual help, with no clarity on whether the missing portion would ever be restored. The message sent to states was not just technical guidance, it was also a policy signal that the federal government was prepared to accept a month of underpayment if no new funding arrived. The tone shifted somewhat the very next day. On November 5, 2025, FNS issued a revised memorandum titled "An Update on SNAP Benefits and Administrative Expenses for November 2025." This is the document that pushed the 65% figure to the center of the debate. In it, FNS announced that after reviewing how it used the SNAP contingency reserve and administrative funding, the agency could trim some of its operating costs and redirect more money toward direct benefits. As a result, instead of cutting benefits by around half, maximum allotments would be reduced by 35%. In practical terms, that meant households would receive about 65% of the maximum benefit amount they would normally be entitled to in a regular month. A closer look at the text shows FNS trying to demonstrate that it had done as much as possible within the confines of the contingency fund. Figures in the memo, including a reserve of a little over $5.2 billion and an increased share for direct benefits after tightening administrative spending, are used to argue that 65% is the highest feasible level if the agency is limited to that pot of money. However, the document is notably silent on the possibility of drawing from other federal nutrition accounts beyond SNAP itself, an option the federal district court in Rhode Island later said could have been used in an emergency. That silence is what pushed the memo beyond a narrow technical update and turned it into the core of a legal and political dispute. The policy picture continued to move quickly after the November 5 revision. On November 7, FNS sent a new letter to SNAP regional directors informing them that the agency was moving to implement full benefits for November. This letter came after the federal court in Rhode Island ordered the administration to fully fund SNAP benefits for that month. In the letter, FNS acknowledged that it was working to make the necessary funding available that same day so states could prepare and transmit full benefit files to their electronic benefit transfer processors.
From a language standpoint, the November 7 letter had a very different tone from the earlier memos. Instead of focusing on the limits of the contingency reserve, FNS emphasized compliance with the court order and promised to move toward full payment. For SNAP recipients reading only that letter, there was reason to believe that November would return to normal and that they would no longer have to live with half or two-thirds of their usual benefits. That expectation lasted just one day. On November 8, FNS issued yet another memorandum, this time with far more blunt content. The document, later quoted widely by national news outlets and reproduced in court filings, stated clearly that any November SNAP payment files reflecting full benefits would be considered unauthorized. FNS instructed states not to transmit full benefit issuance files and to immediately undo any steps they had taken to issue full November benefits following the November 7 communication. It also made explicit that states were required to continue using the partial benefit framework based on a 35% reduction in maximum allotments, matching the 65% benefit level set out in the November 5 revision. In this memo, FNS went further by linking compliance with the guidance to federal support for state administrative costs. The agency warned that if a state insisted on issuing full benefits contrary to the new directive, the federal share of SNAP administrative funding for that state could be suspended or clawed back. This is a powerful lever, since many state human services agencies rely heavily on federal money to run the program. As a result, even states facing intense pressure from their residents and lower courts would find it difficult to openly defy the November 8 instructions. The 4 documents issued between November 4th and November 8 show clearly how FNS and USDA adjusted their stance in real time in response to legal and political signals. On November 4th, the priority was to prevent the program from collapsing entirely, even if that meant a month at roughly 50% of normal benefits. On November 5, the agency tried to soften the blow by raising payments to 65%, still within the bounds of the contingency fund. On November 7, in the wake of the Rhode Island court order, FNS briefly shifted toward full benefits. And on November 8, after a temporary stay from the Supreme Court, the agency moved back to the partial model and ordered states to reverse any preparations for full issuances. Reading these documents closely reveals how SNAP recipients' benefits ended up in a gray zone between legal reasoning and budget mechanics. FNS memos are filled with phrases like unauthorized issuances, management of the contingency reserve, reductions in maximum allotments, and federally funded administrative costs. For households that rely on SNAP to buy food every month, those technical terms translate directly into a simple question. If benefits are issued at 50%, the remaining balance on the card will cover only about half the month. If the 65% level is used, families still lose nearly 1/3 of their benefit, forcing them to cut back portions, switch to cheaper and less nutritious food, or rely more on food banks and private charities. From an economic and budget perspective, the FNS documents also expose a tension between different federal priorities. When the agency claims that 65% is the maximum attainable within the contingency fund, it is acknowledging that paying full benefits for a month would require money from outside its usual funding streams. That is precisely why the federal court in Rhode Island later ruled that the administration had not fully complied with the order to fund benefits in full, arguing that other federal accounts could legally be tapped in an emergency. In that framing, the court viewed full SNAP benefits as an obligation that must be protected, while FNS and USDA framed their decisions around the limits of the funds they directly control. Set against the broader context, it is clear that this is not just a debate for lawyers and budget analysts. SNAP is a cornerstone social safety net program serving roughly 42 million people at a cost of $8 to $9 billion per month. Every time FNS wrote a line adjusting the percentage reduction in maximum allotments, it effectively rewrote the food budget of tens of millions of households. For older adults living on modest pensions, people with disabilities, single parents raising children, or part-time workers with unstable incomes, the drop from 100 to 65% and the ongoing fight over whether full benefits would ever be restored was not just an abstract policy question, it was the difference between a fridge staying reasonably stocked or running low well before the end of the month. Looking ahead, even though the November FNS memoranda are now part of the official record, the story they tell is still unfinished. The ultimate significance of these documents will depend on 2 factors: The first is how the federal courts resolve the string of lawsuits over the administration's responsibility to fund SNAP during the shutdown, particularly once the Supreme Court weighs in beyond temporary orders. The second is whether Congress chooses to approve additional appropriations for the program, which could ease the pressure on the contingency reserve and make it easier to maintain full benefits in future crises. Until those questions are settled, the FNS documents dated November 4, 5, 7, and 8, 2025 will remain a case study in how a major social welfare program can be pulled into a vortex of law, budgeting, and politics, with recipients themselves bearing the most immediate and visible impact.